Thanks to everyone to coming out on this sublime Vineyard Day to be here for this conversation with my dear friend and summer resident Valerie Jarrett.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so good to see everybody. I have to tell you, I landed 2 hours ago. I went right to Nancy's. I had my fix of fried shrimp, and now I'm ready to go. But there's no place like home.
Where's my fried shrimp?
I would have brought you some if you'd asked.
Okay, you should have saved some for me. So Valerie decided, we all knew that you would probably write a book. But we didn't know what kind of book you would write, because your resume, lends itself to a book of this kind. You've served on boards, you were a member of the Daley administration, you were the longest serving senior advisor for President Barack Obama.
I love you guys. And today's his birthday.
Yes.
So happy birthday.
Before we leave, we should sing happy birthday loud enough for him to hear wherever he is on the island. But not only was she the longest serving senior advisor to President Barack Obama, she was also the longest serving senior advisor
To any president in history.
to any president
Which I
in
find
history.
unbelievable. Like, why would you leave a day before the last day, right? I left after the Obamas left, when Secret Service finally said, girl, you got to get out of here.
But in your book, you write not just about your Obama years, but you write about your family history in Chicago, and what a family it is. There are probably 25 family members that are here on island. If not now, they will be by the end of August. And it's a family that's very tight, a family that's very accomplished, and a family of very strong women who were very ambitious at a time where it was, I'm not going to say unusual, but kind of bawdy to do that, because the world didn't expect that of women then. So as a young child growing up among so many accomplished women who had used their voices, not just to lift themselves up, but to lift other people up, what was expected of you? What did you think the world expected of you as a young woman?
Well, that's an interesting question. So a little bit about my family. So Barbara and Jimmy Bowman, my parents, are responsible for what you see today. They gave me unconditional love. They gave me a safety net of support, the sense of infinite possibilities, but also the sense that whatever I tried to do, if it didn't work out, they'd catch me. And that the expectations were high, not in terms of who I would be, but what I would do, in that whatever you do, their theory was, you have to just be excellent at it. And they never cared, really, what I did in terms of a career. They just said, work hard, work twice as hard as everybody else, and shoot high, and if it doesn't work out, you'll be fine. And there was a sense of resilience, I think, that was built into me. And I think it's because I do come from a family, men and women, of trailblazers. And so one example would be my great-grandfather was the first African-American to go to MIT. And that in and of itself is a little remarkable, right? But what really makes it remarkable for me is that his father was born a slave in Wilmington, North Carolina. And he was freed after the Civil War, and he became a carpenter. And he saved enough money and had the foresight and appreciation of education being the path to prosperity to send his son to MIT. And I used to often think about what must that have been like for the son to say goodbye to his father, go north, not far from here, and be the first. And the sense of being a first and being a trailblazer is something that each of my family members has done in a variety of different ways. And so I think that in a sense makes it easier to dream and big and believe that anything is possible, because we're used to breaking new ground. And my mom really did work at a time when most of the women in her generation didn't. In fact, my mother, who will be here in 2 weeks, is turning 91 in October, right? And she still works full time. In fact, one of my cousins who lives with her, not that she's not capable of living on her own, she's actually doing a favor to my cousin, called me called me this morning to say she had to drag my mother out of the garden yesterday. I don't know how hot it is in Chicago, but it was too hot for her to be out there working all day. And so, and her attitude is, if you're on this earth, be purposeful and do something. And she still teaches graduate school. She still drives, too, which I really wish she wouldn't do. Watch out when she hits the island. But in all seriousness, I think in one way I thought, how will I ever be able to live up to these folks who were trailblazers and firsts? And on another way, they just instilled me the sense that just do something purposeful with your life. And if you are trying really hard, then whether you get the A+ or a title or whatever, it doesn't matter. It matters that you gave it your best.
You know, there's a stamp that was issued
After my
after your
great-grandfather,
great-grandfather,
yes.
Robert Rochon Taylor.
Yeah.
And at the unveiling of the stamp, which is a big deal. If you've never been to one of those ceremonies, it's actually worth attending. You learn quite a bit about the background and the history and the artist that actually does the rendering. And I was fortunate enough to be there for the U.S. Postal Service unveiling. And I remember specifically there was a moment where they were talking about his history, and you were looking up at the ceiling. You were just sitting there and you were going like this. You were looking up. Do you remember that? Do you remember what was going through your mind then?
It
And just the leap in history from...
Well, so in our family, we knew my great-grandfather did something that seemed unusual, but I think, as is the case for many African Americans, we didn't really think that anybody else thought it was all that special. And so my grandmother, she had all these photographs on the wall of her home, and she would tell me the stories behind each and every one of them. And I took pride in it, but I wasn't sure that anybody else would appreciate it, let alone that the federal government would consider my great-grandfather worthy of the stamp. And he went on to be the first African-American architect in the country. He designed almost all the buildings on the campus of Tuskegee University, then Tuskegee Institute, and he lived there most of his career. And he also designed a bunch of the schools that Julius Rosenwald, who founded Sears and Roebuck, created. 5,000 schools he created across the South. And it was his contribution to the education of African-American students all over our country. And Julius Rosenwald is somebody else who doesn't, I don't think, get the kind of recognition he should. But he and my great-grandfather paired up. So I think sitting there that day and seeing my entire family from all over the country who showed up for the ceremony was a very special moment, to say the very least. And it was just wonderful to be surrounded by family and dear friends who also showed up to pay tribute to his contribution.
So when you left Chicago, you studied at Stanford. You went all the way across the country. And then you came back east. You jogged halfway across the country for law school. You went to the University of Michigan. And you write in your book, quite honestly, as does Michelle Obama in her book, Becoming, about going to law school, working hard, marching across stage, getting that degree, and then realizing, I don't really like the law that much.
Well, to be a little bit more specific, what I didn't enjoy, and I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody in the audience, I did not love the corporate practice of law at a big law firm. Just seeing who's going to get up and leave now when I say that. Some of you are probably going, yeah, I know what you mean. And I had this plan coming out of college that I just needed a plan. I thought everybody should have a plan, right? So I made up a plan to go right to law school, discover my passion in the practice of law, because I didn't really have one. I went to law school, frankly, because I couldn't figure out what else to do. And then I was going to fall madly in love and get married and have a baby by 30 and then live happily ever after. That was my plan, right? Some of you are nodding because you probably had a similar plan. Well, and I did everything on my plan. I went, well, almost everything. I went right to law school. I married figuratively the boy next door, in that our moms grew up in the same apartment building that my grandfather managed. His father was friends with my father. Our grandmothers were friends. I'd had a crush on him since I was 8 and he was 12. Totally unrequited until when I was 25, he finally looked at me. And I thought, I'm going to marry you. What could go wrong with that, right? Oh, so much could go wrong with that. I did have my daughter just shy of my 29th birthday, and I should mention, as of 3 weeks ago yesterday, I am now a grandmother. And they will be here in 3 more weeks. I'm not sure I can stay. I may have to make a quick trip back to D.C. to see them. But so she was the best thing I ever did. But I did begin my book miserable with my in my office at my fancy law firm with a magnificent view of Chicago, of the lake in Chicago, and I would just sit at my desk and cry. And I thought, well, I don't like my husband, and I don't like my job, and I do like my daughter, and I have to leave her every day to go do this. And will she ever actually be proud of me? And so I attribute Laura with really motivating me to listen for the first time, perhaps in my life, to the most important voice, and that's the quiet one inside. And it said, run. And I had a very dear, run out of there at least. And so I had a very dear friend who worked for Mayor Harold Washington, first black mayor of Chicago. And he said, look, you love Mayor Washington. You were a volunteer on his campaign, knocking on doors and getting people to turn out to vote. Why don't you think about public service? You'll be a part of something bigger than yourself. And there was something about that bigger than yourself that resonated with me. And so I took this incredible leap of faith, and I walked away from the fancy office and the big salary and all the trappings of a law firm, and I became in-house counsel. And I say that because I really loved being a lawyer for the city, because my clients were the citizens of Chicago. And it taught me so much about service. And I practiced for 4 years, and I moved to the mayor's office and then ran the Department of Planning and Development. And it is there that I learned what public service is all about. And I always encourage people who want to go into public service to think about the local level, because your constituents are proximate to you. You cannot get away from them. They follow you to the grocery store, the dry cleaners. You take your kid to the park. They're there. And they force you to listen to them. And that's as it should be. I mean, service should be about listening to the people that you're there to represent. And when I worked in the mayor's office, one of my jobs was to go out and talk to the people who showed up at the mayor's office furious about something. And the reason why you knew they were furious is they took off work. They probably already called 100 times and they weren't getting an answer. Got a babysitter, tropped down to City Hall, and they say, I want to see the mayor of Chicago. And instead they got me. And so they were disappointed right away. And it was my job to put my arm around them and make them feel heard and try to solve their problem. And I thought that was such a great experience for all the other service that I've done in life, teaching you that you're on all the time and that you should be listening all the time and that you should try to make government represent the will of the people.
So when I read that part of the book, it was not just about you finding your voice. It was also constituents learning how to find their voice and speak up for themselves. And I couldn't help but wonder about your constituents in Chicago and also, Americans in the country who aren't the ones that show up, who aren't the ones that wave signs, who aren't the ones that make 100 calls, who sit quietly and throw socks at the television at night,
or
as many
bricks.
people are doing right
Sometimes
now.
bricks.
And don't speak up. How do you make sure that they're represented and that their views
that's
and their
a very
voices
good
are heard
question.
also?
So you have to try to meet people where they are. And when I worked in local government, we spent a lot of time out in community, hosting community meetings, knocking on doors and encouraging people to come. And look, I get it. People are busy and they're thinking, why do I have to force government to do what it should do on its own? But government is only as good as we demand that it be. And what I realized, maybe most acutely in Washington, not as much in Chicago, that is, if we don't show up, I can assure you who does. Special interest groups show up, lobbyists show up, people who understand that government will bend to the will of whoever's pushing the hardest. And so our job was really trying to encourage people to appreciate the fact that we cared about what they wanted and we were there for them. And it's hard because you have to be willing to earn their trust. And in fact, it's one of the things that I've said to the candidates who are now running in the Democratic Party. And that is, look, campaigns are really hard, and they should be, because you need to understand that nobody's going to give it to you. You have to go out there and earn their trust and respect, because they're putting their lives and the lives of their loved ones in your hands, who is not just the president of the United States, but the mayor of Chicago, the alderman who's on the school board, have a dramatic impact on our daily lives. And people who are trying to get those positions need to appreciate the fact that it should be a bond of trust. And again, I learned all of that at the local level.
So when your dear friend and former boss, former President Barack Obama, decided to run for office, it was not an epiphany. I mean, it was really a deliberative process.
For president or for his first office?
For his, well, really, for president, I was thinking about for president, but even it was deliberate when he was thinking about running for Senate, and when he was thinking about running to represent his district in Illinois. But really, what I'm asking about is a decision to run for president. He had served in the Senate for a short time. He had moved to Washington. Michelle and the girls had stayed back in Chicago. And people were encouraging him to run, eager for him to run. There were signs around Washington, Obama, '08, we're ready, why wait, that were showing up. And I met the guy who was actually placing this all over the city. But he was not sure that he was ready. What role did you play in helping him make that decision and get comfortable and fully embrace the reins and make the decision to run for the highest office in the land?
Well, one of the reasons I encouraged him to do it is because it discouraged him from running for the U.S. Senate. And in fact, his wife and I organized a brunch at my home to try to dampen any interest he had in running for the U.S. Senate. And the reason why is he just run for Congress and lost. And so our view was, if you can't win a congressional seat, what makes you think you can win a statewide office? And he had other plans in mind. And he, in the course of about 3 hours, he went from convincing us not only that he should run for the U.S. Senate and that his time was right, he'd learned an enormous amount running for Congress, that he wanted to apply towards the U.S. Senate. And he said, look, I've been all over this state, and mostly people who represent their districts outside of Chicago or in Chicago rarely go downstate. And he said, I go down there all the time. I'm really curious about farming and agriculture. And I show up, and when I show up in those towns, it's big news because nobody from Chicago shows up. And I sit around the table and I talk to them. I know a lot about this. And I think I could actually represent the state. And I think that they now know me because I've been down there for a couple of years.
And he had
regularly.
strong relationships with
And he had
reps from downstate.
The leader of the Senate was somebody who was prepared to endorse him. So he had all these reasons for why he should run. And I remember I said to him, I'm afraid that you'll lose. And if you lose, your political career will be over. And he said, well, if I'm not afraid, why are you afraid? It's a good point, right? He says, my political career, and I want you all to get on board with this. And so I thought it gave me pause when he said, well, why are you afraid? And I started thinking about the fact that what's the worst thing that happens? You lose, and then he gets to go to that corner office with the fancy view and make a lot of money. It's not that he didn't have a career waiting for him. And so in the end, we were on board. And I remember Michelle Obama said to him, now, if you run and you lose, then all this political stuff is over, right? You'll go get a real job. And he promised her that if he lost, that he would do just that. So she said, okay, I'm for this. Let's get this over with. Didn't turn out that way. So long way of saying, when it came time to him thinking he wanted to run for president, I really thought you could just feel it in the air. It was, long after he'd given this, well, not long after, a couple years after he'd given the speech at the Democratic Convention right here in Boston in 2004. And I'd been sitting there in that convention center. And I went from being like this nervous big sister wondering, well, like, what if his mind goes blank? It's like the biggest speech he's ever given. Like, what if the teleprompter goes down and he can't remember what he wanted to say? What if nobody likes the speech? I mean, all these things were going through my head. And when I saw the reaction, not just in that room, but around the country and the world, I thought he had something special to offer. And that if he believed in himself, then what would stop him? Now, Michelle Obama, on the other hand, wanted to know the nuts and bolts of, is this practical? What will be the sacrifices that we will have to make on the family? What will it do to our daughters' lives? She was very pragmatic. But in the end, she thought this was his time, too. And so it was easy to get on board. And frankly, once she was on board, there was no stopping him. But I will say a funny story, and this says something back to your earlier point about my parents. So my parents thought this was maybe the most ridiculous thing in the world, that there was no way in their lifetime our country would ever elect an African American. And my mom grew up in Chicago during Jim Crow. My dad, D.C., the same thing. They both had experienced more than their fair share of discrimination, and they just didn't think our country was ready for this. And so when he was campaigning, and I started spending more and more time away from Chicago and away from my day job, my parents were getting worried, and they it's fun that you support your friend, but you need to get back to work, girl. And when he lost New Hampshire, and I was just looking at his speech from New Hampshire, I don't know why, but it was a really good speech. And when he lost New Hampshire, my mother said, oh, honey, don't worry. Next time it'll work out. And I said, you don't know Michelle Obama. There's not going to be a next time if we don't make this work this time. So fast forward the weekend after he won, he and Mrs. Obama were on 60 Minutes, and you could just feel the love between the two of them. And it reminded me of the first time I'd met them in 1991, before they were even married, and this chemistry that they had and this sense of hopefulness in the air. And I watched it with my parents, and my dad was very ill at the time, and in fact he was in rehab, so we watched it together in his room, and it was so magical. And at the end of the interview, my mom looked at me and she said, "How did you know that he could win? Not necessarily that he would, but even that he could win. Why did you believe so strongly that this could happen?" And I said, "Well, Mom, because you raised me to believe that if you work twice as hard and you have a vision and you're resilient and you dream big, anything's possible." And she looked at me, swear for God, deadpan, and she said, "Well, I never believed that." And then my father, he pipes up, "Yeah, me either." And it was the first time I realized, and it was really, I was shocked, and it was the first time I realized that my parents had given me this incredible gift by raising me aspirationally, not shackled by their reality, but free to discover my own. And what a wonderful gift that was for me.
Yes, and that was something. That was something that was unique to that generation. They had to believe in something that was not manifest in their own life and not burdening that next generation with their frustrations. So now you're a parent and a grandparent now. Did you pass that message on to Laura? Did you tell her that she'd have to work twice as hard?
I did. I told her, I didn't put it quite as starkly as that, but I said, nothing comes easy, and life, it's not what happens to you, it's what you do about it. That was another one of my mother's mantras. And you'll be fine. And I remember one time when I was grown and she was grown, I stumbled and I fell and I really hurt myself, I thought. And she looked at me, she said, "Mom, you'll be fine." I thought, uh-oh, coming back at me, right? But Laura, to her, now, one thing she did that I don't understand, she did go to a big corporate law firm. And I'm like, did you not pay attention my whole life? Your whole life I've been telling you. But when she decided at exactly the same point I did that it wasn't for her, she swerved and never looked back and didn't go through the hand-wringing and the soul-searching I did. So I'd like to think I instilled in her this sense of that the adventure of life is when you stop craving the straight, narrow, straight line, and when you give in to the zigzag, in fact, embrace the zigzag. And so she's done that. So I always say that Laura is like Valerie Jarrett 3.0, much better version of myself.
It's a compliment that she would, I'm sure, take. Politics, it's interesting because we have 6 women on stage at the Democratic presidential debates. We are used to seeing women in very high positions in the White House, on Capitol Hill. But within our lifetimes, we didn't see that. We've seen a lot of progress in a very short period of time. And it really accelerated quite a bit in the last 10 to 15 years. When you were working on the Obama campaign, confident that he would win, did you, first part of the question, imagine what role you would take on in an Obama administration? And did you imagine what life would be like as a woman working in the White House? Did you fully understand?
No, none of that. No. I think, and you know this because you were right there, when we were working on the campaign, we were just working straight out. And I never really gave much thought at all because I had a life in Chicago. I had a really good life in Chicago. My family was there. And it frankly, at one point I thought, well, maybe I'd like to be the ambassador to France. And I don't think Jane Hartley is here. She was our ambassador who spends a lot of time on the island. And I remember teasing him and thinking, I said, you're going to make a lot of new friends. But just remember that if in fact I do want to be the ambassador to France, that you should let me do that. And then as it got closer to the election, a good friend of mine said to me, if he wins, you are not going to want to be all the way over there in France. You can go to France anytime. You can go visit the ambassador, which I did do. You're going to want to be right there. And when I thought, as you know, Michelle, that I considered throwing my hat in the ring to take his place in the Senate, and my family all thought I should do that. My friends all thought I should do that. The 2 people who thought I should not do that were Michelle and Barack Obama. And they made it clear that they wanted me to go to the White House. And when he described the responsibilities, which would really be that gateway into the White House for the American people and a whole range of constituents and state and local elected officials. I couldn't have imagined a better job. And then once we got there, he appointed me chair of the White House Council on Women and Girls. And that was all I could hope for. So I know that I had the best job I'll ever have while I was there. And I used to tell him all the time, my job is so much better than yours. When we couldn't figure anything out and we worked hard and we had a good process and a lot of due diligence and homework that went into our decision making, just saying. But when... All right, that's as far as I'll go, but enough said. But when we really, really were stumped, we would go, here you go, President Obama. And he used to say, when are you going to give me the easy things? And we'd say, oh, no, we made those decisions. We just give you the stuff that's really hard. Look, the hardest thing in all seriousness that a president can do is to put our men and women in harm's way. And those are the decisions that he would anguish over, as well he should. And I remember when he decided to send more troops to Afghanistan, and this is a president who had opposed the Iraq War, and when he was convinced after a lengthy debate with his military that he should add people to Afghanistan, where did he announce it? At West Point. And I remember sitting in the audience with these young cadets looking up at him, hanging on his every word as their commander-in-chief, and he wanted to look right into the eyes of the people who had the most to lose by his decision. And so it's a hard job. It's a very hard job. Mine was magical.
What did you learn about the limits, not just the possibilities, but also the limits to political power when you were working in the White House?
There are limits to political power. And I will say, we live in pretty unusual times, I think. And not just now, during President Obama's time in office as well. And look, there are two schools of thought. There are those who say that the old way of doing it, when, say, the Senate was a club and they would go into the back room with, cigars and no women and make decisions that affected our lives without consulting with us, wasn't necessarily the government you would want. But I also don't think that it was good for us to have people just decide to say no, just like walk in the door and the answer is no. And people used to say to us, well, if he would just schmooze them more. Let me tell you, no amount of schmoozing in the world was going to change the political calculus that I think that was made beginning on his first day in office to just say no. And it made it very difficult to do even policies that had been bipartisan in the past, like the Affordable Care Act was modeled after the law that you have here in Massachusetts that was passed under Governor Romney, a Republican, I might add, with a bipartisan support. And so we thought, well, if we do something modeled after that, why certainly a Republican or two or 5 or 15 or 20 or 30 will vote for it. And I think, unfortunately, we've gotten to the point where people are so afraid to come to the table even for fear that they will be primaried on the left or the right. And that's why I believe in mandatory voting. Anybody else agree with me? Oh, I knew it. I knew it. Everybody, when I first started saying this, said, oh, it's impossible. It may be impossible, but I think it's the right thing to do for two reasons. One, it would force civic engagement. And if you knew you had to vote, and let's say you were only going to be fined $25, I'm not saying something exorbitant, but if you knew that that was just a part of your responsibility and it's kind of in the culture, then you would probably do it. And I think that would be good because more voices would be represented. So, for example, 43% of eligible voters did not vote in the last presidential election. That's not actually a democracy when that many people sit on the sidelines for a whole range of reasons. But the other reason why I think it's important, and I got this from somebody in Australia where they have mandatory voting, is that the country really is like a bell curve. And the money and the energy tends to be on either extreme. But most people are somewhere in the middle. And if politicians knew that and they had to appeal to the majority, I think it would give them permission to compromise. And I always believed, and it's interesting, there's this whole, the press is now absorbed with progressive or practical, pragmatism. That's it. Well, why can't you be both? Why can't you both have bold, big, visionary ideas, but realize that you can't let perfect be the enemy of the good? And to all the people who said, well, President Obama, why did you do the Affordable Care Act? Why didn't you do the public option? That was what was very popular among much of our constituents at the time. And yeah, he could have held out for the public option back then, but then you know what? 20 million people wouldn't have health care, and we wouldn't all be protected if we have pre-existing conditions. And so that's kind of my point. You have to just move the ball down as much as you can, but it would be a lot easier if if everybody had that vision, and that they woke up every morning thinking about what I thought about in the mayor's office, which is how can I help you, the American people, as opposed to how can I help me, the politician.
One of the jobs that you took on, one of the responsibilities that you took on in the Obama White House was not part of your official title, but that was not just looking after women and girls as part of the commission, but really advocating, watching out for women that were part of the administration, particularly those that worked at 1600, and helping them find their voice. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it was something that some of them really struggled with, figuring out how to speak up in a meeting, figuring out how to be heard. How many women in the audience have had the experience of saying something and then a male says exactly the same thing and people listen, sorry fellas, but this happens, repeatedly to women, and suddenly the world rises up to greet him when it didn't hear you. So you worked a lot to help women find their voice. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So, and this was a learning experience for me because I had known President Obama for so long, and I knew his story up close. I knew that his mom had always worked and was a single mother and sacrificed greatly for him while she had her profession. His grandmother had worked, and in fact, he tells a story all the time about how his grandmother, who worked in a bank with a high school education, smart as a whip, would train men who would then leapfrog over her. And then he's married to this extraordinarily talented woman, and he always was supportive of her career. And then he's got 2 girls, now young women, who he wanted the sky to be the limit. And beginning, we were trying to figure out, well, how do you build a culture that is inclusive and appreciates the diversity as a strength? And so I was co-chair of his transition, and we went about the business of making sure that the White House represented a whole range of perspectives and voices and expertise. But none of the women, with the exception of myself, actually knew him very well at the senior level. And so they came to the table, as we all do, with their prior life experiences. And so when they went into a room, and I would remind you, I don't think I need to, but when President Obama took office, the economy was in a free fall. Our banks were on the verge of collapse. The automobile industry was literally in bankruptcy. We had 2 wars underway, a lot going on, to say the very least. And none of us had worked together as a team before, even those of us on the campaign. That had been different than working in the White House. And so we're all trying to get to know one another. And let's face it, as often happens when tensions are high because of the substance of what we were dealing with, men's voices tend to get higher and women's voices started to shrink. And so I said to him, I've noticed, particularly when you're not in the room, because he's so deliberate in how he empowers people. The people spoke up a little bit more around him, but when he wasn't in the room, the least of what Michelle just described about men saying something and everybody listens and women not feeling like they were being heard. And so I tell him this, and he was like, that cannot be, not in my White House. And I was like, well, yeah, it actually is. And so he said, well, let's invite the senior women over for dinner, and I'm going to talk it through, because that's not the culture I want to create here. And so I went to each of the women, about 12 or 15 of us, all running departments, and I said, he's going to ask you about the culture here and what he can do to improve it. So you better tell him the truth. Because if you don't and you just say, oh, Mr. President, everything's just fine, then I'm going to look stupid. And I don't want to look stupid. So we had this dinner, and I remember it was the same night, and I say this in the wake of 2 more mass shootings yesterday, but it was the day of Fort Hood. And so President Obama, because this had happened on our military base, spent the whole day in the Situation Room, and several of the women said, I bet he doesn't come because he's dealing with this horrible, horrible mass shooting. And of course, she showed up right on time. And he spent about 2.5 hours. He spent so long with us that some of the women you could feel they were just nervous, like I'm taking up too much of his time. And he made it clear he had nowhere to go. And he went around and he had everybody speak. And what I remember most is not what they said, because they said what you would have expected. But what he said was this. He said, if you don't speak up, then I don't have the benefit of your ideas and your perspective and your expertise. And I won't make as wise of a decision. And so he said, this isn't actually about you. It's about me. And your job is to make sure I make the best possible decisions. And so I want you to fight not for you and your ego, but for your ideas, knowing it will help me. Well, when you tell a room of women that they're not doing their job because they're not speaking up and he wants them to, it was so empowering. I cannot express to you. And so then at the end of the dinner, he said, look, culture takes time. So give me a little bit of time, but I'm going to work on this, and I'm going to talk to the guys, and we're going to get better at this. But if you find that we're not making progress, tell Valerie, and we'll have another dinner. And so after that, I decided, well, how about we'll just start having dinners with the women in the White House on our own, not with him, but just we'll all get together. And so what happened? We got to know one another, and we began to hear stories about our children and our parents and our families and what we did before we got to the White House. And we became not just colleagues, but we became friends. And so when you walk into a meeting and you see sitting around the table people who you actually know and who you know care about you, that is liberating, and it empowers you in a way where I always say that there's safety in numbers and that relationships matter. It's not just enough to do the work. It's important to build relationships so that you can work on the culture. And at the end, fast forward, at the end of the first term, President Obama was asked by a reporter, how would you describe your culture in the White House on your first day compared to the last day of your first term? And I'll never forget, he said, on the first day, I had the best players on the field. Best players on the field. At the end of the first term, I had the best team. And I think that's kind of a lesson to all of us, right? You've got to work on building your team, and it can't just be because you think it. You have to be intentional, and it has to permeate the organization. And so I felt, because of my relationship with him, and because I knew what it was like to not have a mentor early in my career. I knew what a difference it was when I did have a mentor working in City Hall, that I wanted to make sure that I left the door open and helped the people who were coming along so it would be as easy as my mentor had made it for me 2 decades earlier.
You're active on social media. You're out in the world. I'm
thinking about shutting down social media,
well,
you guys.
I was working my way
I'm
there.
thinking about it. I don't know. Yeah? You think so? No? Instagram I like. It's such a better crowd, frankly. No offense to all you on Twitter, but Twitter can be so mean-spirited.
And that is my question to you.
Right?
You, as a high-profile woman, as a high-profile member of the Obama administration, and now as a former member of the administration who travels the world, you know, I follow you. I've known you for a long time. I know how tough you are. But man, they throw darts. I mean, it's just like a rain of fists. How and people, and then they'll just say, just saying, just keeping it real, while they throw another bomb in your direction. How do you develop a thick skin so that doesn't get inside of you?
Yeah, it's such a good question.
You continue to go high when people go low.
That's right. It is right. So I write about this in my book because, first of all, you have to remember what President Obama said to the women in the White House. This isn't about you. You are, when you put yourself in the arena, you know that you're going to become a target. But you have to remember, you have to take the long view and remember why you are in service. And when you get over the fact that this is your personal feelings, but rather what awesome things can you do with the platform, that makes it a little bit easier to do what I call absorbing the pain. And the trick is to absorb it without it making you numb to what people say. Because sometimes, even though people say mean things, they could be right? So you've got to be able to take in what's reasonable, but also not let it paralyze you or cripple you. And I think part of it comes with practice. And I've had a lot of practice at it, beginning, again, working in City Hall, where I would go to community meetings. And the first time you show up in a community and you go, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you, people yell and scream at you. And it's not because of you, but because of their past experiences with government. And so you have to say, okay, I'm going to keep showing up until I can earn your trust. And you just go back time and time again. And I think having had experience where some of my closest friends now are people who used to yell at me 3 decades ago, of earning their trust, just as I said a while ago about what candidates have to do. You can't expect people to just love you because you show up. You have to show them who you are. And just as you would in any relationship, they need to test you and kick your tires and lift your hood and see what you're made of. And so that's a piece of it too. And then the other thing I think we all have to do, and this isn't just those of us in the public domain, but you have to surround yourself with people who wish you well. And I am telling you, when I was younger, I didn't always do that, beginning with my husband. But we're not going to go too far down that path. You have to read the book, the detail. In the book, I do. But you need people in your life who will lift you up and who believe in you, will tell you when you're wrong and give you the straight truth, but who also provide you with the elixir of love. And it starts with family, but it's also, I'm an only child, so my friends are the siblings I chose, and keeping them close and encouraging them to keep you grounded. And when I was in the White House, I had brunch all the time with some of my dearest friends on earth, and we spent a lot of time hanging out together, and that helps you go back out and fight for another day. But I think at the essence of it, it is learning how to absorb that pain, because if it is truly service, it's not about you.
Let's take this to them and get some questions from
the audience. Oh, yes.
Let's bring them into the conversation.
Please join us.
We have microphones on either side. If you want to make your way, I see someone getting there quick, fast.
And because we have people coming up, I am going to try to be snappy with my answers, which I never am. And it's funny, I always tell people, because it's part of my cathartic coming to who I am and finding my voice. I used to be painfully shy. I mean, painfully shy. Like talking in front of 10 people would be more than I could do. So to the shy people in the audience, just know one day you could go from being painfully shy to being incapable of shutting up. Hold that thought. Practice.
All right. Let's start right here. Tell us who you are, please.
Hi, my name is Richard Goldenberg. Live in Massachusetts and have a place in the vineyard. Love it here. Here with my wife, Janet.
Hey, Janet.
So the strategy, when they go low, we go high. Famous strategy now. Did not produce a win in the last presidential election. Is that still the right strategy for the next one?
Yes, it is. And I'll tell you why. Because the strategy is more about our core values than it is about winning any given election. And I think what you have to do, and it's hard, look, you're talking to somebody who went through painful, gut-wrenching, soul-crushing stages of grief after the last presidential election. I didn't see it coming. It was devastating to me. And I think what it forces you to do is to take the long view. And what it did do was excite and activate a whole bunch of people beginning the day after the election with the Women's March. And let's be really honest with one another. I bet you everybody who showed up at that Women's March didn't actually vote on Election Day, right? I mean, I'm just being candid with you. You know that's true, and for a whole host of reasons. And so, but it didn't end there. There was the climate march. There were the young folks from Parkland who did the March for Our Lives. Millions of people all over our country coming out to help support reduction of gun violence. It's the Me Too movement, and it's Time's Up, and it's the midterm elections where we saw voting ticking up. But the reason why Michelle Obama obviously is the one that coined the phrase is because it is about our values, and it's about the fact that just because somebody else decides to go down in the gutter, the children are watching how we behave. And if we want to model good behavior for the future, it's easy to go high when everybody else is going high. It's a test of character to go high when there are people all around you going low. And just and also it's a distraction from what you're trying to do. When President Obama gave his first joint address to Congress, some of you may remember in the middle of it, where he was talking only about the Affordable Care Act. It was unprecedented to have this huge audience just to talk about one issue. And Representative Joe Wilson yells out in the middle of his remarks, "You lie." What unbelievable disrespect, not just to the man, but to the office. Now, was it tempting for President Obama to stop in the middle of his speech and give Joe Wilson a piece of his mind? Sure it would be. Did he indulge that self-centered impulse? No. which gets to what I see happening today, just for a minute. Like every single moment that either the president or somebody else in his sphere tears down a congressman and his district and calls it rat infested, then they're not focusing on moving our country forward. And so you cannot get distracted by it either. So it's who we are, it's our core values, it's our character, it's our integrity, and it's just hugely unhelpful to moving the country forward. So yes, that doesn't mean that we don't have to get out. That doesn't mean that just because there's people are now woke that we should just sit back on our hands and presume that the outcome will be different, because it won't be unless we work our fannies off, which I, for one, intend to do, and I hope you do too.
Tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Lori Lowenthal. I live in New York. I live in New York City, but my heart lives in Katema. And I have a pretty serious question about what happened. I'm interested in the behind the scenes, as honest as you feel you can be, strategic decision making behind two things. And I think they both very much relate to being the first black president and trying to shine better than gold to pass for silver. The decision to allow the Merrick Garland not being, to violate really any process that would fulfill the constitutional intent of a president appointing the Supreme Court justice, absolutely unheard of, normalized something that should never have been tolerated. I guess you know what I think. And the other thing is the decision when he was told absolutely what was going on with the Russians. He knew all of this stuff that was going on, and he chose not to confront the Republicans, not to even ever make it public. He bowed down. I love him more than any president in American history, but I think the dynamics of that are fascinating, and I'd like to know how it went from the inside.
Really good questions, both of them. So let me take Merrick Garland first, because it still gets me like this. So not readily evident today, but we do have separations of power. We have what the president can do, and we have what Congress can do. And the president cannot unilaterally confirm someone to the Supreme Court.
I understand.
So we appointed Merrick Garland. We had enough votes, we think, to get him passed. One person, Mitch McConnell, made the decision to violate historical precedent, as you put it, and block even a hearing.
I'm asking
so there was
about
nothing we could do.
So that was your decision to let it go.
We didn't let it go. We pushed it until the bitter end. But they simply, and Mitch McConnell was very open about it. He said, I'm not going to give him a hearing.
I remember.
So it's not within President Obama's ability to do anything about that. And because we didn't, and this is why, in a sense, this whole last 10 years has been a civics lesson, and gets to one of Michelle's earlier questions in terms of the limits of the power of the presidency. The president, all he can do is appoint. And in my opinion, he appointed the most qualified person to the Supreme Court, chair of the D.C. Circuit, the second highest court of the land.
It was not an activist response, though.
Well, I don't. What would you imagine he could do differently? I'm just curious.
Rhetorically, possibly a lawsuit.
A lawsuit, we would have lost. Absolutely.
Rhetorically, well,
absolutely, we would have lost a lawsuit. We couldn't find a single lawyer who would say that the Senate does not have the full power to advise and consent, and that you can't force them to do it.
he's brilliant with rhetoric. He could have done something amazing with rrhetoric to warn people.
Oh, I wish he could have walked on water. All right, that's one. So, believe me, there's nothing I would have liked better than Merrick Garland. And of course, now, what was the first one?
The first one, and the second was, she believes she said, and
Why did he decide? And I think I know why he decided. I guess everyone thought Hillary would win, but let it go on the Russians and all that incredible intelligence.
Okay, so first of all, and maybe many of you won't remember this, but our intelligence community, in an unprecedented way, made a public announcement that the Russians were interfering with our election on the same day as the Access Hollywood tape surfaced. And the announcement got completely drowned out by the press. And every day thereafter, President Obama went to Mitch McConnell again, and he said, and shared the intelligence with not just Mitch McConnell, but with Leader Pelosi and everybody else who was chair of these important committees back then. He briefed them on what was going on with the Russians. And he said to Mitch McConnell, I don't want this to look like I am using my presidency to do something that would be perceived as political and therefore discredit the outcome of the election, which would hurt Hillary Clinton should she win. So I want you to join me, and let's go to the secretaries of state who actually oversee the elections. Let's share with them what we see as happening, and let's try to nip it in the bud. And you know what Mitch McConnell said? No. Just like he just recently refused to support legislation that would beef up our protection against the Russians. And so he just simply wouldn't do it. Now, of course, President Obama could have gone around the country, I suppose, campaigning on what the Russians were doing, but then he would not have been being presidential. He would have been being political.
What about something in the middle?
Well, he tried to do the middle. He thought if he could lock arms, and listen, let me tell you, obviously it didn't work, but he thought if he could get the Republican leaders to work with him on a bipartisan basis, it would inoculate us, and this again is taking the long view, because if he did something that was blatantly political, which is how that would have looked, then what's to stop not just this president, but the next and the next and the next?
So I want to make sure that we get to the other.
I'm going to be faster, but those were two good questions.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm so happy with my book there.
Tell us who you are.
Oh, I'm Jane Cahan, a shy person from St. Paul, Minnesota, and Oak Bluffs.
So I'm going to do something unusual because we have three people at the mic, and I want to make sure we hear all your questions. So I want you to ask them all, and then I'm going to ask you to give us a bonus round answer of all three questions. Can you
All
do
right, but
that?
you see how my memory is. You might have to
but I'm
refresh
going to
me.
help you with that.
Okay.
So you're from St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm from Minnesota, too.
I know. I read your memoir,
You
too.
betcha.
You betcha.
There's a line in the book where you say that President Obama had faith in the decency and goodwill of people, and I feel like he made all of us feel that way, and I really want that feeling back again. Do you have any advice for the candidate that we might have to help us get back there?
I do. That's a good one.
Hold on. Advice for the candidate to get that feeling back. Tell us who you are.
I'm Lottie White. I'm from Southern California. I'm a guest of Wendy Kroll, and I'm having a fabulous weekend. It's my birthday weekend.
Happy birthday.
So this has been fantastic. Couldn't ask for a better weekend. Thank you, first of all, for your service.
My honor.
And I love Obama. And I want you to know that I talked my Republican husband into voting for him twice.
Thank you.
And he loved him and is now really a Democrat. But who do you think can win the election?
Okay. Who do you think can win the election? And
Hi, my name is David Burstein. I live in New York. My question for you is about something I think you probably have a lot of appreciation for, which is all the parts of government that are very unsexy in the bureaucracy that make things work. As everybody knows, the Trump administration got a whole bunch of briefing books, which is now widely documented. They never read, they never did anything about. My question is, even with the best Democratic president, should they win, the reality of 4 years of lack of maintenance of a lot of those things, what's the realistic ability that some of those things may just never materialize again, and your perspective on thinking about what of those things might be really important to save or do something about, because you can't just rebuild all those things with 4-year-old books sitting around necessarily?
All good questions. So I think because in closing, I'll try to wrap it up into a message that I hope you'll view as not just a hopeful message, but a challenge. And so I don't know who should or will win the nomination, but I know that the advice that I've given all of the candidates who have sought it, and I've spoken to several of them, is, don't try to be Barack Obama 2.0. Be yourself. Be authentic, but be in it for the reasons he was in it. And that is, be in it because you think that you, through hard work and effort and a team that shares your vision, can move our country forward and purposefully try to make it better than we found it. And that I also encourage the candidates who are running to focus on what they're going to do and not tell me why I shouldn't vote for the other people who are running, because I can figure that out on my own. I'm most interested in what you think you can do for us. And also because everything you say about the other candidates in the Democratic primary, I promise you will be a commercial in the general election. And so why would we give them any ammunition to go on? So they didn't actually follow my advice in the last debate, but that's okay. There's still hope for the future. But it takes this unbelievable strength to be positive. And when President Obama started talking about hope and change, there are, I think, some people who thought, oh, isn't that lovely? It's so easy. It takes the audacity of a deep spirit to be hopeful at times like this. And I guess it is most important that we all take that long view and to realize that our country is going through a tumultuous time, and not just because of who the president is. We have telecommunications and social media bringing us closer together, but also tearing us apart. And so many people, and I say this particularly to the young people in the room, that there's no substitute for relationships. And that's part of the theme that you've heard throughout my remarks today. And that we have to learn how to put our devices down and actually listen to one another, listen to those with whom we disagree without being disagreeable. And that's what we try to do. We try to bring in as many different ideas as possible and keep an open mind. And I feel like the direction we're going now is to close minds and to have us all in this echo chamber where we can be comfortable as opposed to learning how to be comfortable being uncomfortable. It's so easy to not listen to voices that present a different opinion. And our country is at its absolute best when we are bringing ourselves closer together, not pulling us apart. And I've had the great luxury of traveling over the last, 12, 13 years, but on my book tour, where I spent a lot of time just talking to people. And the people I talk to are the reason why I'm still hopeful. Because even though what you hear a lot up here and in the media is the nastiness and the toxicity, most people are good people. Most people are just trying to have a good family, raise their children, send them off to have a better life, retire with dignity. They care about their neighbors. And unfortunately, the distortion that we're hearing can get into our heart if we let it. And so it is incumbent upon each of us to fight for the goodness, be a role model, resist the temptation to follow the negative down the rabbit hole, and try to bring out the best in us and really view ourselves as our brother's keeper, as our sister's keeper, and recognize that elections have consequences. And it doesn't necessarily mean it defines our country, but it does impact a lot of lives, and usually the lives that are the most vulnerable. And so I think we have a responsibility to not only find our voice, to feel empowered, to use it to be a force for good, but also to help others who don't have a voice have the representation that they need. So we are counting on you, and when we come back in 2021, let's hope that the world is a better place because of your efforts.
Valerie Jarrett, thank you very much. And thank you for the fabulous book, Finding My Voice.